All right, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Airbus A320 Tech Talk. What do all those buttons do? Thanks again for joining me. I'm back in New Orleans today on an overnight, second time this week. So thank you again for joining me and keeping me company. I appreciate you tuning in. So we are going to pick up our discussion where we left it off last time, moving down the overhead panel here. The next area that we've got to cover is the anti-ice section up here. So as always, we're just going to start off and kind of talk about some high-level concepts about the systems themselves, why they're there, what they do for us, and we'll come back and talk about the buttons and the lights, of course, and we'll finish up with our Q&A section. And if you watched the last video, I was trying to show you guys a clip of the electrical relay changeover when we went from external power to APU power. And I couldn't get the audio working, so I think I've got it figured out. We're going to give that another shot. If you haven't seen like the first part of the lead up to, for that video, it's in the electrical overhead panel section there, a video or two back, I think. So you can go ahead and check that out if you're curious to catch up with the discussion about what we're talking about there with all that electrical business. But let's go ahead and jump in and talk about everything today. Let's first just bring up a graphic of the outside of the airplane here. So first of all, the systems in specific as they relate to those buttons and what we're going to talk about today is just these sections here. It's the forward leading edge heated section of the wing and the forward leading section of the engine inlets here that we're going to talk about. And of course, there are other portions of the plane that have this anti-icing equipment and measures put in place to kind of do different things for us. But like I said, I just want to kind of keep today's discussion condensed just to those buttons specifically in those systems. So first of all, we want to talk a little bit about why do we have these systems on board the airplane in the first place. So first off, the wings themselves. If you study basic aerodynamics, it is a very well-known fact that ice accumulation on wings will severely impact the lift producing capabilities that the wing can do for you. It adds drag, and it can cause all kinds of nasty aerodynamic effects if ice is allowed to accumulate to a certain point on the wings. And this is obviously it's something that we don't mess around with at all, and it's very very important that we be proactive and stay on top of that, keeping the wings clear of ice because it's such a major safety concern with flying the airplane. So that's first of all, right off the bat, why that system is there. The engine system is there, for a little bit different reason. Not so much the lift, creating picture of this whole, equation that a flying airplane is constantly, undergoing. But the engines themselves need to have protection from damage and protection for their performance. So as you can imagine, if ice was allowed to accumulate on the forward section there as it broke off, this would be a potentially a large and heavy object moving very fast, rear, towards the fan blades. It could damage them. It could damage inner workings of the engine. Also, we want to prevent ice from accumulating on the blades, the inner, portion, or sections of the engine, anyways, for performance reasons as well. So, you just rely on the throughput of the normal air that's passing through there for it to efficiently and whatever you want to say, keep creating the power and thrust output that it's designed to create. So it's obviously the reason that we want to have it on the engines there. So let's move on next and talk just a little bit about the atmospheric conditions that need to be present for ice to form on the outside of the airplane or the engine inlets there. And that is from outside air temperature or a total air temperature of 10 degrees Celsius or less anytime we're operating in visible moisture. And that is all the way down through a static air temperature of negative 40 degrees Celsius. So let's first talk and take a pause about one of these, the most important concepts to understand when we start talking about aircraft icing is really this concept of static air temperature and total air temperature, and just to kind of understand what those things mean to us. And like I said, they are very important. We start to consider hey, where is my airplane at this present point in time, and is icing going to be a factor? Is this a possibility? So just to have a little bit of physics understanding about what those things mean. So first of all, static air temperature, just as the word implies, static means stable or standing. In this case, the static air temperature would be the temperature that you would feel if you were just, let's say you were up at altitude 35,000 feet and you just could stand outside the airplane at a standstill. What would the temperature in the atmosphere be at that point? That would be your static air temperature. Well, of course, this is not, all that pertinent to us, like being inside of a jet and flying along very fast. So we need to kind of have this other measure of a correction factor, let's say, that's put on top of that static air temperature reading. And this is how we get this reading of total air temperature. So the total air temperature is just the static air temperature corrected for the effects that friction has in the airplane or the outside skin, or all the areas that are under contact of this fast moving air around it. I mean, just once again, basic physics principles tells us that as we move air particles, let's say like over a certain surface, I mean, there is an amount of friction that's created, and it actually changes, like we said, the actual temperature that the way that I think about this is that total air temperature is the temperature that the skin on the airplane is actually feeling. And like we said, this is pertinent because icing can happen in different like windows, let's say, of this scenario, and it's just, like we said, it's important for us to just be aware of that when we're flying around. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys about just that relationship. And you might hear these terms getting thrown back and forth, the total air temperature, the static air temperature, and it's just important that we have an understanding of what exactly these things mean to us. So hopefully that makes sense. Leave some questions down in the comments there. If it doesn't, we'll talk a little bit more about it. But let's next move on and talk about each one of the systems themselves. So the first one we'll tackle is the engine here. I mean, this is pretty straightforward, just graphic right out of the ECAM here. Just shows us very basically, I mean, we're taking hot compressor bleed air out of the high pressure section here. We're just routing it through this tubing. We have this engine anti-ice shutoff valve here, and that's actually what we're controlling with that button up in the cockpit. So it's just an open and close type situation. It just routes hot, warm air into the forward section of the engine here, and that's just going to heat it up to the point the manufacturer has designed it to. And the extra air is going to be vented overboard. It's kind of indicated by these little arrows here. And I pulled up a graphic of an Airbus engine just to kind of show you. If you were standing up next to the airplane, it's just this little vent port here is the engine anti-ice, like overboard venting section there. So that's just all that is. That's what it looks like. And yeah, pretty straightforward there, like I said. Let's talk a little bit about when exactly are we going to use the engine anti-icing equipment there. Is this also, like I said, it differs from the times that we are trained to use the wing anti-ice system. So first of all, we're going to use the engine anti-ice anytime we're on the ground or we're in the air operating, like we said, at either an OAT, outside air temperature, or static air temperature, or a total air temperature of 10 degrees Celsius down through negative 40 degrees static air temperature. So let's just kind of, I'll try to step you through like a normal flight in a cold day. Let's say you're leaving a cold place, like we said, it's 5 degrees Celsius outside. Maybe there's a little bit of drizzle in the air. So we've determined that, we're in visible moisture. The temperature is in the range that we know we need to use this at. So, we're going to push off the gate as soon as we get the engines running. We're going to turn the engine anti-ice on. We've probably calculated, actually we will have calculated if we anticipate these conditions to ensue through the time we're going to take off. We actually have different performance numbers that account for the engine anti-ice being on when we're taking off. So just one little sidebar there. But we're going to basically run that engine anti-ice, up through, the whole portion of the taxi out and taking off and, climbing up until we get to the point where we're clear of visible moisture. So let's say, once again, we're climbing out now, and as we go up in altitude, we know the temperature typically drops off. So we keep climbing, and let's say that we're just in a kind of a high level cloud area, and we've needed to use that engine anti-ice all the way up to the point where we get down to that the point where the plane is reading a static air temperature of negative 40 degrees Celsius. So the book tells us that if we're in a climb portion or we're up at cruise and we hit that negative 40 degrees Celsius static air temperature point, we actually can turn the engine anti-ice off at this point. And this. I think you can read deeper into physics, but I mean, I think the idea here being is that like once it gets down to a certain point, the particles or the moisture anyways is so cold that you're actually flying through these microscopic like ice crystals, and it's not wet or soggy enough, like think of it that way, to actually adhere to anything. So supposedly we're safe to turn the equipment off, and these particles supposedly are just like bouncing off the outside of the aircraft. And like I said, this is over my head. You could probably have a long discussion with a physicist about why this is okay, but this is a widely accepted method of operation. It's just straight out of the books, and this is just how we do it in the real world. So let's say we're back to our scenario there. So we've leveled off, and let's say we've been in this high level cloud all the way up to the point where we're getting ready to descend down. So let's say we are at the point we're going to start a descent for our destination. So here is an exception to that rule of what I just told you. So if we start a descent, the thrust comes back to idle, and the aircraft obviously starts pitching down. This is the one time that we're actually going to use the engine anti-ice, once again, if we're still in visible moisture, and we might still be at a static air temperature of less than negative 40 degrees Celsius. So let's say it's negative 50 degrees Celsius outside, but we're in a descent. The reason why we need to use the engine anti-ice in this scenario, it kind of comes back to that business that we talked about a moment ago about the relationship between the static air temperature and the total air temperature. So you actually, when you start descending down through the atmosphere, you get into more dense air, and therefore you're creating more friction. So it might actually, what's occurring at the engine there, it might get to the point where you're creating just enough friction to, even though your temperature sensors are reading a certain temperature, the actual point on the engine skin or the engine leading edge there, let's say, might, with that friction, raise up to get you into that point that might be just a little bit below negative 40 degrees Celsius. And if you're still in the visible moisture, you can get icing to accumulate there. So that's kind of the philosophy about why we use that in those given situations. And of course, as we're coming down through the atmosphere, I mean, let's say we get below a cloud deck, and we're at 10,000 feet now, approaching our airport wherever we're flying into, and let's say, oh wow, we're completely clear of the clouds now, we're out of the visible moisture. It might still be below those the temperature range of 10 degrees Celsius there that we kind of outlined, but because now we're in no visible moisture, we could turn the engine anti-ice off, and we could land like that. And let's say we're arriving into a place that we had some standing water on the ground, and that temperature on the ground is still very low, close to freezing or whatnot. You might, at that point, after you've landed, you might reach up and you might turn the engine anti-ice on again at this point, because we're operating on a contaminated taxiway, let's say, and it's cold outside, and you could once again potentially ingest some ice into the engine section there. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys as we kind of step through all those things. Like I said, let me know if you have questions about that. And one other thing that I think is interesting to mention also as it relates to this engine, and kind of the physics principles that are going on the entire time the engine is running, is it kind of has to do, part of why this is all set up the way it's set up is also, I just wanted to mention like the Bernoulli's principle, like physics business, because if you picture the air passing through the front section of an engine here, it's always under this suction, and it's always, we know, once again, talking about the Bernoulli stuff, when you have an increase in velocity, you have a corresponding decrease in pressure and also temperature. So that's kind of, just one other thing to make mention of with specific regard to the engine, because you always have this air being sucked through the engine, and it is subject to temperature changes as a result of those things because of the physics principles. So kind of a little bit of add on there. Maybe I hope I'm not overwhelming you with too much information, but just something that I think is kind of neat to consider when we're talking about the engines there. So that pretty much tackles the engines. Let's talk now about the wing anti-ice. So we're going to use the wing anti-ice, not necessarily if we're only operating in one of these ranges with visible moisture, but we actually we're told to operate the wings either when we're expecting ice to accumulate or when we are in an active icing condition. And you might say to yourself, well, how do you know when you're actively icing? And this is one of the things that I love pointing out to people about the Airbus. For as advanced of an airplane that it is, the indicator that we have to let us know if we're in icing conditions is actually very simple. And it's this little post that sticks out. What we're looking at here is the kind of the center section between the two windscreens, like right in front of the pilot's faces there. There's this little icing probe that just points out, and all this is a visual thing that we can just look out the window and say, oh, in this case here, you can see a little bit of ice accumulation here, and that would tell you that you're in an active icing condition. This cracks me up because it's so simple, and honestly, at times this can be kind of hard to see at night. And if you look at these little kind of indentations here, there's actually a light or this inner lighting system that you can reach up on the overhead, and there's a switch for that. We'll talk about it when we get to that point again, but it's just supposed to illuminate this thing a little bit, and you can kind of see if there's ice out there. But I got to say, like, after flying the thing for a while, I mean, it's actually pretty hard to see sometimes when it's dark outside, and sometimes you're not quite sure if there's actually ice packing on out there. So of course, with general philosophy, if we're ever unsure about it, we're going to turn the wings on. But it's kind of interesting to me that Airbus chose to go with this design. And this does differ from every other transport plane that I've learned to fly up to this point, because most of them have something that looks like this. This ice indicator or ice detector sensor, it works just a little bit different. This little probe, sticks out in the atmosphere, and this is able to sense a difference in vibration that occurs on this little finger here if ice were to accumulate on it. So it just obviously, like, as the shape of this changes, as if ice were accumulating, it causes this little resonation to occur, and the system picks it up, and it actually give you like a message on your in the flight deck there that'll just say, oh, you're accumulating ice, or we're in icing conditions or whatever. So I think it's a better system because it's a lot more hands-off. It's automatic. It's just there kind of looking out for you all the times in cases where it might be hard to see what's happening outside the airplane, or you're just dividing your attention doing other things. It's just, like I said, kind of an interesting thing about the Airbus, I think, that they chose to go their route as opposed to this one. But hey, what they have works, and I guess just is what it is. So something interesting to point out to you guys. So let's come back once again and talk about just the engine, or I'm sorry, the wing anti-ice system here. So right off the bat, something that's interesting about it is only the 3 outboard sections of the slats here are the ones that are heated. And the research that I've done, and the reason why I guess the manufacturers have decided this is an okay scenario, and this is actually the case in a lot of different airplanes as well, it's because the geometry of the wing towards the root, it's a lot more like fatter section than this little kind of sharp section towards the extremity of the wing. And supposedly it is less susceptible to accumulating ice or building it up, and if it does, just the way the air is moving around it, it breaks off much more readily. And like I said, I think the point is that it just doesn't accumulate there as much as it would on the outside portions of the wing. So once again, you could probably track down an engineer or an aerodynamics person to kind of talk with you more about that one and explain it. But that's just the basic idea here about why it's okay to just have these outboard sections of the wing heated there. So pretty straightforward. Also, it just when you open up this. You turn the wings on, it just opens up a portion of the bleed system there to allow the hot air to kind of route out towards the sections of the wing there that, like we said, are heated. And there's another graphic here to show you just a little bit more about the piping inside there. So once again, we're taking hot compressor bleed air out of the engine here, and it routes through these little just these metal pipes. There's this kind of telescoping portion that, of course, the slat moves in and out depending on where we have the setting, or, what aerodynamic condition we're in and where we need it to be at. But it routes hot air out to the extremity here, and it exhausts it into these sections. And it actually, after it's exhausted, it kind of exits the rear portion of the slat there. And it heats the wing up, and it does what it does. So pretty simple, straightforward there. One other thing also that is interesting about the Airbus, I think a lot of other airplanes operate the same way, although it might not be automatic in some cases, but it's certainly a factor that actually right off the bat, I can tell you, I remember doing this on the CRJ, for example. I used to fly that. You would actually have to automatically turn the wings off in the scenario that I'm about to outline for you, but Airbus has kind of made it into an automatic thing, which is interesting. But that has to do with the scenario of, let's say we're taking off from a cold airport where it's snowing or something. If you were to reach up and push the wing anti-ice button, it would open the valves for a 30-second test. So you could just kind of verify that everything is on or it's operating properly. But after that, the valves are going to close automatically, and they're going to stay off until you get airborne. Now, the reason why this is kind of set up like this is because when you're taking off in this type of situation, you are undoubtedly going to either need to be de-iced or anti-ice. So that's, we're talking about type 1 or type 4 fluids, and we could have a whole discussion on that, later on down the road about, when you need which one for what purposes and what conditions. But basically the reason why this is set up like this is because, like, after you've applied these fluids, if you were allowed to have heat interact with these fluids that are kind of designed to stick on the wing at least long enough for the plane to get off the ground and up into the air where it can kind of do its own thing, that the heat will actually disturb or disrupt the properties of these fluids, and it kind of defeats the purpose, or it might kind of make them fail, so to speak, like prematurely, and allow for ice to accumulate on the wings while we're taking off or while we're waiting to take off. So it's kind of the reason why the system is designed to say, hey, once again, you could leave the button in the on position, but the wings actually would not be getting heat to them until you get up airborne. And I can't remember, I was digging in the manuals trying to remember the exact trigger about when they come on. I believe it's at slat retraction, but it might be a weight off wheels kind of thing, or a radar altitude or something like that. So if anybody out there knows, back me up and let me know. I didn't have the time to do all the digging and find it, but apologies for that. But you get the concept and just the point that I wanted to make there with, like I said, why these wings operate the way they do in that scenario. So one last thing to tell you guys about the engine and the wing and its systems is they're actually not interconnected. So from a bleed standpoint, they're not interconnected. So you can't use bleed air from one side of the engine to heat the opposite side's wing or the opposite side's engine. And this is call it what you may, but it can become a factor sometimes. I remember I was operating one flight where we had a problem with one of the engine bleeds, and we were trying to dispatch through an area where we knew we were going to go through flight into known icing conditions, and of course this was something we could not do. So we actually couldn't dispatch the plane because of this deficiency, or I don't want to say deficiency, but just because of the virtue of this design just being the way it is. And of course you could understand, it's just a complexity and a weight thing and all this kind of stuff, why they design it in this way. And the times when you encounter these situations are probably pretty rare. So it is what it is. But just like one thing to let you know, like I said, you cannot use cross-side bleed air to accomplish the heating of the wings or the heating of the engine inlets there. So hopefully that all makes sense to you guys. Like I said, wrapping it up, the last thing I wanted to do is the Q&A section here. So let me bring up the question that I wanted to address today here. So one of my viewers, Leonidas, thank you for tuning in wherever you're at. I really appreciate you watching. But he had a question, once again from the last segment, about the packs and the cooling and the environmental situation inside the airplane. And so he says, let's suppose we were at the gate with the APU running on a hot day, perhaps the outside air temperature being about 34 degrees Celsius. The three compartments show 24 degrees Celsius inside the airplane. What happens to these temperatures if we shut down the packs? So this is a great question. If you were to shut down the packs in this situation, of course, we're going to lose the cool air that's being routed into the airplane, and the plane is just naturally going to find a hotter temperature. If you had a lot of people on board the aircraft, there's a lot of body heat being generated, and the plane's actually going to heat up pretty quickly, unfortunately, and become very uncomfortable for people. And it, interestingly enough, it can get to the point where it's like over 100 degrees, like in the back of the airplane. And there have certainly been situations where if you have some type of situation, for whatever reason, you've lost your air conditioning packs and you can't cool the plane down. This is one of those situations where you're kind of putting people at risk. Overheating them, and if it was bad enough and you had no way to rectify it, you really have to offload the airplane and figure something out, because it is a dangerous environmental situation that we really try to avoid. So and then just kind of the flip side, he had a second part of the question, just what happens if you're on a winter day and the outside air temperature was 4 degrees Celsius and the packs went out. Well, the packs not only provide cooling air, but they also provide warming air as well, just to maintain the cabin temperature. So the same type of thing would happen there. The plane would just cool down a little bit to kind of meet the outside air temperature. But I would actually argue that, in this situation, if you had a 4 degrees Celsius day outside, it's not extremely cold. I would actually say the inside of the airplane is still going to heat up if you had all the bodies on board. So hopefully that makes sense to you there, Leonidas. Pretty straightforward explanation, I guess you'd say. And one last thing I could think to tell you is, I was driving in my car the other day and I was thinking about your question, and it's kind of the same concept where, like, how in your car you have two buttons. You actually have there's one button that controls like the fan and the recirculating air inside the cabin there, but then you also have a button that's specifically for AC, and that actually turns on the air conditioning compressor and all the workings that actually make cool air for you. So it's kind of the same situation. The packs are kind of doing the same job for you. So just the same way, if you were to turn off the AC section in your car, you might have some cool air circulating for a little while because those fans are still on and still blowing the vents on you. But after a certain point in time, you're going to kind of exhaust the cool air out of the system, and the whole car will just heat up eventually. So it's kind of the exact same thing that you're asking here about how it pertains to the airplane. So like I said, I'm going to wrap it up with that video there of the electrical relays and just kind of let you know what it sounds like and all that kind of good stuff. But before I go, thank you again for watching. If you like what you see, hit the like button, subscribe, leave comments down in the section below there. It's kind of what makes this interesting and engaging, exciting for me, and I really appreciate everybody tuning in. So until the next time, thanks for watching, and here we go with the relay video there. So. All right, one more time. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you next time.